Good evening. Welcome, everybody, to this book launch of The Vagabond Princess by Ruby Lal. And it's such a great pleasure to have her here. I've been a huge fan of her writing. This is her fourth installment of books about women in North India, and particularly the women of the Mughal court. I know your book on Noor Jahan in particular, which is absolutely immaculately researched and beautifully written, with such a sympathetic feeling towards her and her plight and her predicaments and her accomplishments, which are teased out with such beautiful prose. So it's really a pleasure here to have her here. I can't wait to read about the Vagabond Princess. Many of you, of course, will know a little about her through Rumer Godden's earlier work. But of course, the wealth of material that is now available, and perhaps new approaches to how one understands her, will be surely brought out by Ruby in this new book. This is a bit of a breakout event from the JLF. Ruby is going to be speaking with William on Saturday. This is Saturday, yes. But we are very lucky to have Lipika Pelham here instead of William to be in conversation with Ruby. And so I want to welcome both of you here. I guess you're going to speak for a few minutes and do some readings, and then a conversation and open up to this discussion. Okay, all right. Well, thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes, I think you can. Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you for those very generous words. I'm hugely delighted to be at Royal Asiatic Society and to be in conversation with Lipika. And I have any number of close friends here. Thank you for coming, and to the guests. A big thanks, of course, to Lucy Doncaster, my fabulous publicist, who's the brain behind all these things. So what I thought, I discussed with Lipika, and I thought I might just read for less than 5 minutes, literally the first page into 2 paragraphs. That should set the scene, so to speak. August 1997, the British Library, London. I waited with nervous anticipation as I skimmed through the card catalogue in the tall wooden cabinets behind the service desk of the Asian and African Studies reading room. A majestic, high-ceilinged rectangular room, it had several long tables, each of which could comfortably seat up to 4 readers on each side. Lamps with light blue shades stood in contrast to the yellow tables. Large portraits of Indian Rajas and other aristocrats from the former British colonies dominated one side of the high walls. Rows of bookshelves holding printed guides and other catalogs drew Pratence's attention. Every now and then, the library staff looked towards the area where the readers pored over the special collections. Earlier in the day, I'd asked to see the 16th century Princess Gulbadan Begum's book, classified as Oriental 166 in the British Library. Gulbadan, literally rose body, was the beloved daughter of Babur, the patriarch of the magnificent Mughals of India, and the first and only woman historian of the Mughal Empire. Writing as events unfolded, she captured the gritty and fabulous daily lives of ambitious men, subversive women, brilliant eunuchs, devoted nurses, gentle and perceptive guards, and captive women and children who died in war zones. Yet Gulbadan's stellar book was relegated to the margins of history, to mere footnotes in volumes on Mughal politics, war, economy, and agrarian histories, all written by men. Before I left India for Oxford, I had seen a 1902 English translation of Gulbadan's work by someone you know really well here, by Annette Beveridge, a British colonial era scholar. It was obvious that Gulbadan was a woman of many quests and journeys. Yet her work had been sidelined by modern historians who shared Beveridge's publisher's belief, articulated in a letter accepting the translation for publication, that it was, quote, of unique interest. A little history, it is but a little thing, unquote. The little history of men's and women's daily lives that enraptured the princess is in fact a masterpiece that came out of an insightful witnessing of heart politics and much more. No distant bystander, she was close to the people whose lives she chronicled. Thus her book was both hers and theirs, a lively prose that shines with unrivaled granular details of Mughal wandering life. So on that August 1997 morning, as I waited to hold the book of this adventurous woman, I did not yet know the depth of her radical thinking, a daring life story tied intricately to one of the greatest adventures in the late 16th century world. 2 decades would pass before I joined together the pieces of that fascinating life.
Thank you. So the book is called Ahval-i Humayun Badsha, or Conditions in the Age of Humayun Badsha, that she wrote when she was 64 on her return from Mecca, Medina, via Aden. And we will hear all about it, the enthralling adventure. So the story starts in Kabul, in the sort of fort of Bala Hisar, picture of which we can see there, where she was born. And he wrote about the Kabuliers quite poignantly in her short story, about graceful women of her family who took her under their wings and formed the landscape of her childhood. The landscape of her childhood was also a childhood full of very important women and powerful women. And they were advisors to kings and emperors, but kept this low profile. As a feminist historian, you then sort of start with unwritten history and make this not just a little history, forgotten, but an amazingly wonderful story. And so tell us a little bit about her childhood in Bala Hisar, the moments, kind of the when she was born and how she was born. Her mother was Dildar Begum, and she was brought up by her stepmother, and then she lost the third and the third wife of Babu.
Yes.
Zubarika. Let's start from the childhood.
Yes, I think Gulbadan's childhood is highly significant for a whole host of reasons, actually. So of course, she is born in Bala Hisar, Hisar literally meaning the citadel. It was a mud citadel. It was also a military base, but the top, these are 19th century excavations, actually, that brought to life some of these pictures. So Gulbadan was born here in 1523. That was the time her father, Babur, the founder of the great Mughals of India, was actually eyeing across the river Hind towards the territories of northern India. So he was heavily occupied in war thinking, basically. He had lost twice the seat of Samarkand, right? In fact, 3 times he had lost it and finally given it up. And so his new venture was basically a base in Kabul, but looking towards the territories of Hind. So I mention this because, yes, there were these amazing women in whose care she was. It's a multi-generational setting. Many women were raising their children together, but they were not just confined to the home in Bala Hisar. The important aspect of Mughal history at this time is that it was a highly peripatetic history in that people moved all the time, women and children, along with Babur and his supporters and his companions, actually spent time outdoors in the tented country, for instance. Women accompanied Babur in war. So these were the conditions. If one could narrow down really the significant features of her childhood, then it would be these formidable women, some of who had also been in war zones, but also being outdoor, right? And this outdoor, this peripatetic, this love of, nature was very much part of the ethics of her upbringing, and something that so living in caravans, for instance, right?
Yeah. And all the kind of royal encampment we don't know much about. So the royal palaces were not just forts and big brick and mortar walls, but they were in tents. So these women would travel with emperors, and they will have their own tents, and they are great royal palaces, but in encampment. So we don't know much about it. So until they came to India and sort of made Delhi their kind of Mughal capital, the life was quite nomadic. And she writes quite extensively about the trips to Kabul hills and wondrous gathering and festivities in imperial tents, picnics, and splendid poetry, and also the magnificent storytelling of adventurous Mughal women. So tell us a little bit about those little stories that don't feature in big histories.
Yeah, so I think exactly. I think the Gulbadan writes, of course, much later on, and we'll come to the point when she writes this unique, unprecedented history, the only prose chronicle of the empire. Mostly women wrote poetry. So this colloquial Persian in which she writes, in the form of storytelling, is pretty much the form within which she grows. So storytelling, therefore, is a highly significant, character of life, if you will. Orality more than storytelling, right? But witnessing of the land, which is why I mentioned caravans. She's the first girl to leave in the first royal caravan from Kabul to India after her father, wins his territories and actually decides to live in India and invites the family to come. And the uniqueness of the memoir is also, I'm tying this because it's tied to her story, is that she actually extends, apart from her own father and his exquisite Babarnama, the great book of Babar, which is very poetic, highly observant, dedicated to all forms of curiosity. She's a bit like that. I mean, this is her travels, her observations, the most unusual moments in those travels, right? She'll write about the arguments, the bartering of women, children dying in war, right? What the camps look like.
And also she had been brought up by various women of the family and not necessarily her mother. So that reminded me of like a kibbutz setup, somehow that children are being sort of brought up by other people and not necessarily the biological mother. And yes, that is fascinating, I thought. And she doesn't kind of describe the setup critically that, the emperors had all these wives, but they had their own power somehow.
Yes, and the power is both spatial, but also, as you're saying, very deeply linked with children.
Yeah.
So it's, I don't want to paint a rosy picture here of various wives. So Babar had 4 wives, her father. And her mother, the oldest matriarch, had lost lots of children at different points. And when Gulbadan, and before her, when her brother are about to be born, she asks her husband to make a promise that the children born of this 3rd wife would be given to her. And Gulbadan's mother's quiet in the documents of the time is suggestive of the tension that must have been there, right? So nonetheless, Gulbadan and her brother stay with the adoptive mother, Maham Begum, the oldest matriarch. And she dies when Gulbadan was 10. By this time, they were in northern India, and then she goes back to her mother. But adoption is not really a word here, right? Because you have parallelly existing communities. So spaces where did they really live? You know, what terms were used for their bringing? How did they move about? These were things pictorially and architecturally interested me quite a lot.
Yeah. And so she came of age, which you alluded to her travel via Khyber Pass. So she was 6 years old, and she lives in this caravan of royal women. And Babur sent his people, his army, to accompany these women to Delhi, where he has now set up his palace and his kingdom. He's one. Another interesting thing is that Gulbadan's brother was born when Babur just won India. And the boy is called Hindal. So it's really interesting because it's symbolic, because Hind is Hindustan, India. So the firstborn is Hindal. It's absolutely incredible. And he then decides to settle there. So the royal encampment, the life in encampment then suddenly comes to an end almost, you know, when by Babur deciding to settle in India. And bringing his family and his women traveling first time, you know, before that, women didn't go to India before he.
So there were a couple of aunts that went, older aunts, and then they came back. And then the first set of family, you know, went. Then another group of people came and so on. So in gradation, if you will, right, the caravans were traveling. But spatially, again, this is really interesting, which is why I mentioned the peripatetic character of the society, which is even when Babur has settled in Agra and areas around, right? The mansions are beginning to come along the river Yamuna, right? But these are early mansions. So architecturally, they would resemble, so mud is really quite important. And it's over time that stone is put into it. To Babur, gardens were really important. He missed gardens.
The symmetrical gardens of Kabul. So he talks about in Baburnama that I missed the symmetrical garden of Kabul. So then he recreates that on the banks of river Yamuna. You write about that.
That's right. And then geographically, you know, I very much enjoyed imagining what it was like to be brought up amongst the hills with different kind of clothing, different kind of food. But once you come to, then you have the riverine district, right? You have this heavy agrarian settlement. What does life look like here? So all of these things, this idea of the Mughals as grand and opulent and owners of, you know, the Kohinoor and what have you, that is much later on. And it is very much part of, it's post-Akbar, and it's part of, this is Gulbadan's nephew, and it is part of the institutionalization of the empire and bureaucratic and official setups, building of cities and palaces. All of this she is going to witness. So this is a tremendous woman who witnesses her father's reign, who's starting all these conquests, her stepbrother's reign, Humayun, who then loses to an Afghan emperor called Sher Shah Suri, and is put into exile for 10 years. And she too, you know, leaves.
She went back to Kabul.
Then she goes back to Kabul, and then she comes back to India when her nephew, Akbar, is now the king, 11 and 12. And eventually, this is the man who's going to build the first sandstone harem of the empire, into which women like Gulbadan will be asked to live, which is a huge transition.
In Fatehpur Sikri, yeah?
In Fatehpur
Sikri, yeah. And that's a kind of Taj Mahal is there, yeah? The Hawa Mahal or
the pleasure pavilion.
Pleasure pavilion, yeah. So you described that quite, you know, I mean, maybe you could read a little bit of that or show it, yeah.
So this is the, on the left is the Panch Mahal, right across is the Mint. These are more the public quarters, but just behind the Panch Mahal is the harem quarters. This is what remains of Fatehpur Sikri, the red sandstone, you know, capital of Akbar the Great.
Yeah. So we moved quite quickly to Akbar, but maybe just as well, because we'll run out of time otherwise. So the Akbar is obviously, built this and wanted to somehow put all the women in that harem. And that was its kind of sign of his power anyway, that women are dignified and hidden from kind of the male view. And that's why he put them there. And he also himself married many Rajput women in order to kind of expand his territory and expand his empire. And there she found this in another kind of freedom in captivity, the freedom that they talked about amongst these women. And this is where she would form the entourage of 11 women that she would later on lead, to Mecca, to Arabia, to the great cities, and traveling through Surat, the Portuguese port, across the Arabian Sea and in Jeddah. So tell us a little bit about how she formed this group of 11 women. How?
I mean, this is the reason to write this book, this story. I mean, up until this time that, Akbar builds the harem and he wants women to live in the harem. It's part of the institutionalization of the empire, right? It's part of not wanting women on the road anymore. It's part of not wanting peripatetic character, but much more settlement. So this is the reason to bring, and therefore, so for the first time in the Ain-e-Akbari, which is the gazetteer of the empire, women are declared pardegyan in Persian, literally meaning the veiled ones. But also, so sacred and secluded and behind the walls is actually for him a sign of respect, right? He is the great emperor in the technical sense of the term. And he wants his women revered. So that is and not to be seen by any Tom, Dick, and Harry, basically. So therefore behind the walls. And this, till this point, I'd done this work in my first book, but when I was on the road with my Noor Jahan book, that book opens with Gulbadan leading 11 matriarchs from the harem and traveling to Western Arabia. And people began asking me about Gulbadan. They started saying, well, who is she? What happened in Arabia? And so when this question kept on coming up, I started paying attention to two facts that I had actually neglected. One was that I knew, but I hadn't quite focused on the fact that when she goes from the harem to Arabia, she actually stays in Western Arabia for over 4 years. The second thing is the manuscript with which I began our conversation and my life's work that I was reading earlier on in the British Library breaks off at folio 83. And as the questions kept on coming up, I had the feeling that the two were related. And that's why I began, writing about
the missing chapter,
the big chapter of the book in some senses. So she comes to the harem, to make the long story short. She comes to the harem, and Vagabond Princess opens with the scene in which she is having this conversation with Akbar, her nephew, saying she had long ago made a vow to visit the holy places, and now the time has come, and she would like to do this. So this is a really extraordinary time. The Muslim millennium was arriving. Like many other monarchs of the world, Akbar had aspirations of being the millennial sovereign, which meant the renewal and the renewer, the person who would enforce balance. There are all sorts of meanings to that idea. Like many other monarchs, he did not go to Mecca and Medina, right? That is, if people of your family went, they could accrue blessings for you. So he had that intention, definitely. And so did Gulbadan. I mean, she was very deeply invested in the project of the empire. But her intentions were also wider than that. She knew for sure that, this was a heavily important mercantile area, that the Western Arabian land was the land of mujawwirs, which are, or mujawwiran, which are in Persian and Arabic, let's say spiritual sojourners, right? But also people like Ibn Battuta, people like Queen Zubaydah. I mean, there's just so many of these itinerant folks who had spent time observing the land, taking in the architecture, soaking in the spirit, but just living, right? Prophetic land land of Muhammad, land of Abram, right? So it's a shared, very interesting land in that sense. So she goes. I mean, she gets the permission.
Yeah,
she goes.
But the situation, I mean, under which she gets the permission is quite interesting for the history of the 16th century as well. So she travels to Surat, which was then under the Portuguese. It's in the southwest corner of Gujarat, and that port was also known as the Blessed Port of Bandari Mubarak. Yeah, and it was door to the house of God, because from Surat that's the only place, only port that you could leave from in order to go to the house of God, which was going to Jeddah, for example, from there. But that was then under the control of the Portuguese. They were the kings of the ocean. You know, they had the Oceanic Empire, then Oceanic dominance. And they then imposed this special taxes on Hindus and Muslims, and I guess on Jews too, because they said that the sea is open to the Christians only, but not to the Hindus and the Muslims and the other faiths. And so she waits there 7 months in order to get the qatas. And Akbar had, I think they had a deal that Akbar would get 1 qatas a year or something like that.
That's right.
Yeah, and so she waits, and there are problems, and they don't want Akbar to have Malabari traders to trade with. So Portuguese then put a lot of conditions on that, on Gulbadan getting the qatas. So give us a little kind of glimpse into the world.
So the assumption was that the qatas was ready, right? But when she landed there, the qatas was not ready. And Akbarnama, the imperial history, had only one line saying the women waited there nearly a year. And I began to think, well, what were they doing in Surat? Where were they staying? What was going on? And then I came across one line in Father Monserrate's commentary, the Jesuit figure to Akbar's court, in which he made the most tantalizing suggestion that the Mughal women were able to board the ship from Surat only after Gulbadan Begum gave the land of Butsaris to the Portuguese. So I began to think, what is Butsaris? And of course, from 16th century to now, map names have changed, things have altered. Turned out Butsaris was very close to the properties of the Portuguese. It is 60 miles south of Surat, and actually the land is called Bulsar. It's very famous for mangoes, and especially Alfonso mangoes that the Portuguese have created, for chicus, for all sorts of things. And eventually she gives this land, and that's when the two ships sail out. And there's this whole scene about how the negotiation takes place, because and these are, now I'm getting into the nitty-gritty of how these scenes are created, because there was a Mughal official called a man called Bayezid Bayat, who left 2 years after Gulbadan through the same journey and had the same negotiation with the Portuguese, and they held his son for the whole day. And he writes this brilliant account of, sort of blow-by-blow account of, who came up, what they said, how did they finally leave, how the son was released, all of those kinds of things. So from there into the Arabian Ocean, into the Indian Ocean, Arabian Ocean, and on, and into the Red Sea, up towards the Red Sea north, straddling, reaching Jeddah, or the land of Eve.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So yeah, and the ship that she sailed in is quite interesting. It's called Salimi. That's Akbar's son, who was born after also Akbar's lost several children, and then Salimi was born. Prince Salim was born, and you probably know about this story from Jodhabai and all the kind of films, the Bollywood films that have been made on Akbar's life. So the ship then kind of came into Jeddah. And according to this 16th century writer, Ibn Faraj, Jeddah was the resting place of Eve, as Ruby just alluded to. So she was Jeddah, the Eve, or the grandmother of the world. Yeah. So the Jeddah was actually a very old city. It was built in 350 BCE by some unknown fishermen you talk about.
That's right. Yeah. And then apparently extraordinary legends. So visually you have to imagine that to write this side of Gulbadan's life, as I leave the Mughal territories behind, I'm also leaving the Mughal archives behind, because none of this is going to, none of the scandal, we'll talk about the scandal, none of the scandal is going to be mentioned in the Mughal records predictably. So I get into the Ottoman records from here on, and to the Ottoman records on ships and topography, al-balads that I, pestered my colleague Marcus about. Tell me about al-balad. Who can I get in touch with, and so on and so forth. So to figure out these steps. So they land in Jeddah, and from there they make their way towards Mecca. The important thing here is I also wanted to understand. So we have ideas about pilgrimage, right? We think this is what people did. They wore the two-piece suit. They did the following rituals. If you study the Western Arabian Ottoman sources, and I'm mentioning Ottoman because this whole land was under the sovereignty of the Ottoman sultans of Turkey, because since 1517 they had captured Western Arabia and Egypt. So Murad III was in charge of this whole land. And this fact is very critical to my story, which is that the way in which the Ottomans made a claim to their legitimacy and rulership in Western Arabia, because they didn't descend from Prophet Muhammad. So the claim was as servitors and protectors of all in the holy cities. That is, be they Bedouins, be they travelers, be they royal guests, all sorts of people were under their charge and protection. So this is this kind of hot house that she's walking into with a group of 11 women carrying tons and tons of bounty from her nephew Akbar, which they're going to distribute.
But that created the tension. That is the kind of the climax of your book. Yes. So she starts giving alms to people, and then she starts giving money to rebuild Prophet's mosque in Medina. So she becomes quite this woman, alms giver, and powerful person. And sadaqat, you talk about that. The word, the Hebrew sadaqah, it's like a donation, and charitable donation. And she becomes quite a famous woman. And then Murad becomes really not very happy about that. He becomes very afraid of who is this person, and who is donating sadaqat. And also through her, Murad III thought that Akbar was spreading, kind of expanding his, his empire somehow, his power, his visibility. And was it then or before that he called himself Amirul Muminin, the faithful, the leader of the faithful?
So the story is this, that they land in the holy cities in 1578. And in 1578, within 6 months or so, Murad III issues a first eviction order against the Mughal ladies. He issues 5 of them. They're all housed in the National Archives in Turkey, which is what I then chanced upon. And there are 3 words that are used in these orders, which were really quite extraordinary. One is the mujawwiran that I've been talking about, which is this, he keeps on saying these haraman of Akbar the Great, these mujawwiran, they've been sitting here.
It is source of a special problem.
They're a source of a special problem.
Yeah.
And the other word he uses is sadaqat. And this became a very critical word for me, because they had brought huge amount of money and cash and dresses and other gifts from Akbar for people like the Sharif of Mecca, Medina, and lots of other places. But apart from those, women were distributing sadaqat. So sadaqat is a very important form of giving. Basically, it embodies the idea that when you give something to someone, it is not that the receiver is elevated. It is the person who is giving is elevated, finds freedom, in other words. And you don't have to give much. If you have nothing to give a date, it is said, D-A-T-E, not take them on a date. If you have even not a date, give them a little bit of water. And if you don't have water, speak a good word, right? So these women were in front of the great mosque, they were in front of the mountains, they were in front of many cities. So the first eviction order lands and they refuse to go. The second eviction order lands in 1579. They do not budge. The third eviction order lands in late 1579. They do not, and not a word about any of this in the Mughal documents. Finally, but of course, Akbar would know, 1580, he sends another Hajj commander. And there's a stray line I saw in the Akbarnama, the Oriental 12988 held in the British Library, one stray line that says, but the women did not want to return, right?
That's 4 years by that time they have spent.
By that time.
By that time, yeah.
So in 1581, then they finally leave Jeddah, and towards the tip of the Red Sea in Bab al-Mandab, which is a constricted passage, you have the Ethiopian highlands to the right as you're going south, and you have Aden to your left. And that's where they have a shipwreck.
We also know about this Bab al-Mandab because of current stories of Houthis throwing these missiles at Western ships. So that is the kind of the narrow channel. That's where they arrive. I think this, I mean, I wanted to talk about this infallibility decree because in her absence, meanwhile, Akbar assumes this famous sort of godlike king status. It's like called Amirul Muminin, commander of the faithful. And even the Ottoman sultans didn't dare assume such a title. And Sultan Murad III was, for obvious reason, really, really afraid of this new emperor from Hindustan trying to expand his power towards the Hijaz, towards the holy cities of Islam. So tell us about this, a little bit about the decree, what that meant, and Akbar. Always we know about Akbar that he was illiterate, and that was, he fashioned himself after Prophet Muhammad, because Prophet Muhammad was illiterate. He's illiterate, but he can bestow great blessing and great sort of wealth of knowledge of something without coming from someone who wasn't educated in a traditional way.
I mean, so Akbar declares this, it's called the Mahazar, or called the infallibility decree, which basically the idea was that he wanted to establish himself as the final arbiter in law, right? And it's very controversial, actually, because there were a couple of jurists who actually disagreed with him, and he packed them off to Mecca.
And there's another book, The Counter History, by
Badayuni.
Batuni, yeah.
So this was not entirely settled. So there is this extraordinary side to Akbar, but also we have to remember this idea of his being illiterate. It's also very intriguing to me because I think it's a modern understanding of illiteracy. This is a man who's extremely playful. He has the most extraordinary, first atelier, a formal atelier that is set up in the empire. The most extraordinary, if you look at the first paintings in the empire called the Hamze-Name, which is actually basically the feats of Prophet Muhammad's uncle called Hamze, as he went around distributing the messages, right? The force that the folios exert actually is reflecting of the force of the young emperor himself, right? He's very syncretic. He plays with all sorts of religions. So there's a lot of playfulness that's going on in him too, right? It's not settled but of course all this creates all these messages and these ideas and concepts creates tension for Gulbadan and him, and I would imagine Akbar also, this is very suggestive. After 1580 he stopped sending any arms to Mecca and Medina,
but that was because of the fourth foreman notices that kicked them out, let's say, eviction notice. And that's why Akbar probably stopped all the donation or sadaqat that he was sending to holy
zakat,
cities.
yes.
Yeah, sadaqat, yeah. And so, I mean, he posed a great challenge to the Ottoman claim to protect holy cities of Islam. And then you then say that Gulbadan would be ambivalent about her nephew's new legal claims. So how do you come to that in her? Yeah.
So there's a couple of things. I mean, one is this itinerant life that she leads, which is by, in other words, a life of less formal structures, right? Less capacity, less full capacities, right? Less domination that she sees under her father and then her brother as well. So this is a guess I'm making, and I think the biographical project, based on these documents, actually allows you to make that kind of suggestion. That's where I'm, alluding to what her thoughts might be.
Right.
Because in everything
But you do it several times in the book, that
Yes.
she is not happy about her nephew's sort of claim to power and calling himself the millennial sort of emperor who would, 1,000 years of peace will come after that, but she's not happy with that.
Well, she doesn't say so. That's the problem, right? The manuscript
But you allude
breaks off.
to that, yeah.
So on the basis of the documentary evidence that I put together and who she is, once I chart her life, that allows me to think. It's a probing, it's a question.
Yeah.
Right.
That's really interesting. So I think we'll run out of time, but we have to go to the dramatic shipwreck that happens in Bab el Mandab. And then the women then end up staying in Aden, for 7 months. And so the royal historian Abul Fazl, who wrote Akbarnama, he writes that the women were in trouble for 7 months in Aden. And then you describe Aden from sea and urban theater, and it's very hot and unbearable. But they're there. And so what happened during these 7 months?
So this is again one of those one-liners where you have absolutely nothing in the records, but of course there are extraordinary social histories of Aden, and you have documents like the Cairo Geniza and so on, where salvage operations are described, right? How the maritime geography is structured, where you're staying, what's the relationship between the sea and the land, right? And the myth that surrounds Aden, which is really quite extraordinary. So one of the extraordinary legends from that time that I came across was, so the epic Ramayana, which is of course translated as well as visual folios are made in Akbar's atelier for the first time. In Aden, you have a very different version. The version is that from Surat to the top of Aden, the tunnel was dug. And it is from this tunnel that Hanuman, the monkey god, actually saves Sita and brings her back, right? So you put these legends, you take the spatial geography, the food, which is very different. And then you have, again, the extraordinary one-liner that the local governor of Aden did not treat the royal women well. And as part of civility, because they were royal guests, actually Murad sends him an order chiding him for not extending the courtesies that should have been extended. So there is the chapter is kind of created out of that, but also it is from there that this officer that I was mentioning, right, who takes the ship from Surat, actually comes, and he, from across the harbor, he sees, he knows that the Mughal women are there. So there's an exchange of letters that takes place. So the letter that he writes to Gulbadan, he includes in his memoir. But when she sends him a letter, we don't know, it's not extant, right? So we don't know what she wrote in this letter. So there's always, for a feminist historian, there are always these moments where you wonder, right? What might have happened. Right.
Yeah, no, I just want to go to this last bit because we'll run out of time otherwise, and we would like to give the microphone to the audience. So the most powerful chapter for me was during the just before the shipwreck, she reflects on what the return would be like. So was she returning to after 4 years in Arabia, 7 months in Aden, and then she would be returning to this harem again, and Fatehpur Sikri and women, and all the freedom would be gone. So she sort of contemplates that sometimes going back to and moving toward coincide. And then she interprets what the meaning of freedom is, to these women, to herself, and, to the people who will be in posterity who will be reading her memoir. So I would like Ruby to read from the Gulbadan knew that the harem to which she was returning.
So the next two paragraphs.
Next two paragraphs.
Gulbadan knew that the harem to which she was returning, a place bound by instruction and discipline, signaled more possibilities than she had thought. Quote, sometimes going back to and moving toward coincide, unquote. Since her adventures across the seas, she knew that the ground for freedom was generosity, that freedom was not absolute. It was, and I'm not quoting her, but I'm quoting a thinker on freedom. It was, quote, won and lost again and again. It is a glimpse of possibility, an opening, a solicitation without any guarantee of duration, unquote. Whether she contemplated such words, we cannot say, but it is to be expected that she mused on what lay ahead. Gulbadan would see her Arabian domicile as an allegory for opening outward, spreading knowledge, wisdom, and influence. A vagabond within, she was nourished by her own lush, benevolent actions. She would hold on to the freedom and the grace she had felt in giving sadaqat. She would preserve the abundance of experience that came in tackling kingly dreams, in pondering her generous actions, even though they were classified as nameshru. It's a word from the eviction orders. Send them back, also from the eviction orders. The women might have thought about this expression many times.
So soon after this reflection, the shipwreck happens, and you describe it in a beautiful kind of language, that a worm clinging on a log and the women. So you got the historical details from other shipwrecks, other histories of shipwrecks, including the Tunisian Jewish merchant, and what's his name again? Whose ship? Beniju, yeah. So you put together snippets of other histories of shipwrecks into this story and paint this incredible picture of these royal women being sort of abandoned and thrown off of their ship and ending up in Aden. So soon after that, we returned to after 7 months, we returned to India, and she's accepted by Akbar, and then when Akbar authorizes or commissions the book, Akbarnama, she's called, and she was also asked to write. And it was the first time ever a woman was called in Mughal history to write, a part of history, a great history of Emperor Akbar.
So this is the first official history of the empire that Akbar commissioned 6 years after she comes back. And he invites the idea, Akbarnama, he invites various members of the family, including older servants and so on, to record their memories of the forefathers, because having that long genealogical construction gives legitimacy, right? And there was only one woman amongst them, and that is his aunt, a woman of eminence, experience, wisdom. There was also his formidable mother, Hamida, who was a commissioner of some extraordinary art, and a close ally of Gulbadan. And actually, this exquisite painting. This is Hamida and Humayun, the second emperor with Akbar, the little boy at that time. The scene is based on Gulbadan's memoir. And I reflect on this painting because there's somebody standing holding a book. And this is a whole iconography that I played with in order to establish who else would it be except Gulbadan holding the book. And there's very interesting ways in which I came to this conclusion after very strong and detailed conversations with any number of art historians about the iconography of the book itself, but also how the book is held, where it is held, who's the holder, who are the people who are shown holding the book. They were almost always eminent people. This is in so this is sorry. So so anyway, this is a painting of Father Jerome Xavier by Keshu Das, who was also a contemporary great painter of Gulbadan. And so this is just showing who are the kinds of people who are shown with a book. This is Keshu Das himself holding his book. So the placement, the texture of the book, and so on. And there is, of course, no woman who has commissioned this. This is an extraordinary. This is a very different painting. It's in the Chester and Beatty Library, and it's one of the finest. It's called. It's a selection from Akbarnama III. And it has some extraordinary, detail on the book itself and the placement of the book. I won't go into that, but this is the painting I was mentioning. And so Gulbadan is very carefully placed at a particular interstitial juncture by one of the finest portrait makers of that time, man called Narsingh. The rest of the painting is made by another painter. So this, I spent a lot of time thinking about this in the final chapter called The Books of Gulbadan, which is to think about her experience and the idea of embodied experience and how she would write this unique book that actually breaks off on folio 83, mid-sentence, and the classic sort of practice, both with manuscripts and some other paintings, was to have more than one copy. So Bayazid Bayat that I mentioned, there are 6 copies of his manuscript that survive. There was this water carrier of the second emperor, also known to Gulbadan, also contributor to the Akbarnama. 6 copies of his manuscript survive. So why is it that we don't have, another of Gulbadan? So these were all, issues I was encountering in this biography.
Yeah, and the sentence that where the book abruptly ends, the sentence broke off almost with these words that the order was executed at once after the blinding of His Majesty the Emperor. And the sentence was incomplete. The book was not completed. And so you think that it could be because it's talking about her half-brother ordering, come round to be blinded, who kind of posed this great challenge to his empire. And that's why it might have been taken out, expunged somehow, from and because a woman is not allowed to write such controversial history of royal a dispute and a blinding of an emperor. I mean, this is how
I actually think she'll have written about Akbar as well.
Yeah.
And we have 19th century critics like Maulana Azad and several other people, some historians of the book like Irfan Habib, who have, talked a lot about the sensorial tendencies of Abul Fazl, what he took, what he removed. We know that about Akbar. So I'm pretty convinced. So here's the thing. I'm not really interested in proving, because we will never have the record. Suppose I do believe that this was redacted, right? But if this was redacted, no document will be left saying we are planning to redact this. You're not going to get that. So I think the historian has to then work with the layers of action that surround this lacuna. That's literally what I was doing in this book, right? So this is not, in my mind, this was not a life and times of Gulbadan, but it is a story about a woman. It's a book about a woman about a book, right? With a book.
Yeah.
That is the point.
And you wrote in an article that so feminist history is embedded in the idea of excavating otherwise expunged experiences dissociated from our worldview of non-dominant people such as women, queer people, enslaved persons. That's the kind of aim of a feminist historian, to have the underrepresented members of history to be presented. And that's what you did in a magnificent book. And I'll let you have the last word, and then we'll
No,
ask the
I'm
audience
just,
to ask some questions. Yeah.
thank you. I'm just looking forward to the questions. There is no last word here.
By the way, when she came back, she was called a Nawab, and that is also very unusual for a woman to be called, titled by Akbar. So Nawab Gulbadan now.
Nawab.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to put that up in order to prove to you that I actually consulted I just wanted to show what a lovely time it was, that, you had to actually requisition. You had to have a requisition slip, which somehow I kept. I mean, I had tons of these, but this is the one I kept. But this is her manuscript. This is not the broken part. This is a part where the formidable first wife is having this conversation with Babar, saying, you have children from other wives. I only have one, and do this, that, and the other. So it's that episode. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I mean, that was I'm intrigued. I can't wait. I can't wait to read it. I'm interested in the different sorts of strategies that you had to engage in. I mean, really a wide range of different sorts of analytic techniques, given the erasure of significant portions of her life, I mean, reference to finding material from the Ottoman perspective, particularly regarding her controversial period in Mecca, and looking at other sorts of documents that speak around the edges of what she may have been involved in. And I was wondering whether you looked at whether there is any record of sort of the materiality of her presence in Mecca, because we know of the gifts from various other prominent people at Mecca, which are recorded and are brought out at various sorts of times. And I was wondering whether there were possibilities for exploring that, or whether those were also censored in time, because one thinks of, one sees photographs of a particular covering that had been given by this Ottoman emperor, that Ottoman emperor, that and which are still there, and they're recorded, and they appear periodically. And so I was wondering whether there was any material presence of you, because she arrived with such a lot of material. She was engaged in lavish gift giving for the generation or creation of merit, both for her and her nephew. And I was wondering whether there was anything like that you had.
That's a lovely question. And, the visuality or the materiality is actually only present in the text.
Mm-hmm.
So things like 12,000 dresses of honor for the Sharif of Mecca, right? There's such visuality in that description for me, or the way the caravan was structured. But literally what was there in Arabia, no, absolutely nothing there. But I do want to say that, I should mention that I wrote much of this book. I was a fellow at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Studies, 2020-21, and COVID was raging at that time. It was the only in-person fellowship in the world. And I was there, and I was writing about this heavily itinerant woman, right? Who travels to, all sorts of places. And there we were, completely bound. But what really helped me was actually sitting with 16th century art books of material stuff, right? So what kind of Quran people carried, right? What were for the Zamzam water, right? What kind of flasks were taken? Because we know that when the first Hajj commander goes back to Akbar, he carries Zamzam water for him, right? They stop at one point on their journey back. This is the last bit they do after the pilgrimage. And there was a little market where everyone was supposed to stop. It was called the Bahrain market, where you got the best pearls, right? So the Hajj commander also takes a few pearls. So these art books, I was able to, there are no Mughal representations of that, but that's why I was saying that the words are the leads, and then you sort of parallel that with.
Let me follow up with one question. I lived in Kota in southeastern Rajasthan in the late 1980s, famous for the Kota Dori of Sari, and which has a wide market in South Asia. And it's the last place that was reputed to be the last place where it was still being handmade. But a significant portion of that production was sent to the Gulf. When you mentioned the the numerous robes, dresses of honor, robes of honor that were sent. I was made me think about different styles of textile that Gulbadan and her entourage may have brought, and that there. I was just trying to think about different ways in which one could see the possibility of her influence through the materiality of different sorts of things and textiles. It made me think. Yes.
Right. So the Babarnama is written in Chagtai Turkish, of course, her father. By the time she's writing, she has spent several decades in India, and Persian becomes the court language during Akbar. So her book is really interesting. It's mainly in Persian, but you do see smattering of Turkish here and there. You also see Hindavi, right, which is the precursor to modern Hindi. So it's a mixture of all of those. That's why. But I would think that Turkish would be very much part of her thinking. So when they go to the Hijaz, they of course have a translator. But I don't think Arabic or Turkish would be foreign to her ears. I think it's this is the time they would be extremely multilingual.
My father was literate. Babu was literate about his writing. So throughout the book, he actually talks about her father writing, walking in the rose garden and writing poetry and verses.
Yeah.
So if Babu was literate, I would feel that,
Yes.
Yeah.
I think this question of literacy in my mind is of course there's no formal education, right? But for royalty, there's cultivation of the self, both for boys and girls. And that includes many things. It includes, above all, poetry. It includes learning by way of storytelling. And a lot of these are didactic tales. So, very famous classics such as Sadi's Gulistan, for instance, The Rose Garden by Sadi, would be read both by boys and girls, right? And these are parables within which you're trained. Polo is very common. Hunting is very common. And then ethical ways of being. How are you going to be as a woman or a man? There are very particular terms. I think all of these things would be part of what we would, I would say, is being literate. I mean, on this manuscript, I have wondered, I have no way to know whether she wrote this herself or dictated it to a scribe, right? Which was also a common practice. But we don't have the first page here, but it says categorically, the Ahwal-e Humayun Badshah, Bannat Babar Padshah, written in such and such, I'm sorry, daughter of Babar Padshah, and, at the hukm of Akbar Padshah, this has been written. So all those things are very much there, but whether she actually really, did it herself, that's extremely hard to tell. Hmm. Yes. Hmm. Well, wish me luck. Wish me luck. I'd love that. Please, tell the goddesses that may a second one arrive. Yeah. 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 Yeah, no, on a serious note, I think it's a really critical question. So here's just something, there's a couple of things, and one intellectual aspect and a political aspect. One is presently, Mughal history has been wiped out from school textbooks and college curriculum in India as we speak. So there are some of us that are fighting that battle and are at-risk scholars, right? That's one side of it. So there's the urgency is really, I mean, it's just, I cannot speak enough about the urgency, but also the public square in India, right? Where the people might think that there isn't a kind of counter to the suppression, right? There's a fantastic multi-generational conversation that's going on. So it's the emergence of a new public square, as I'm saying. On the more technical side, right, my practice has been one in which I don't think you need to dig out new and new sources. The question is, what are you going to do with the sources that you have, right? So in my first book, when I historicized the institution of the so-called haram, we didn't have that kind of social history, but I didn't dig up anything new, right? Gulbadan's manuscript was extremely well known. It had been translated in 1902 by the great Annette Beveridge, right? But it had been marginalized by scholars on some completely idiotic grounds, right? Turns out this is a treasure of a manuscript. So I came to study this as a graduate student here in Oxford. But that didn't mean I didn't go to the so-called classic canon that had been created. That is your Babarnama and Akbarnama and the various Humayunamas. But what happened in my own practice and thinking, but also centrally thanks to Gulbadan, is I began to look at the classic canon itself rather differently, because they too have the sorts of things that she's mentioning. Only we've not taken the care to pay attention to those facts, right? And quite often they're one-liners. They are tantalizing details with which you don't know what to do. And I believe the practice of writing erased history is really to pay attention to things that we habitually turn away from, right?
Everyday life, empires, and everyday life of women, nuts. They're magnified in your.
Yeah, there's, as a first step, that's absolutely essential. But I'm also saying that in the archive itself, right, we'll say, oh, it's only one line. This is not, I mean, what is this Butsaris, right? We don't know. The women didn't want to come back. Who wrote this? Maybe a scribe. To me, these are kind of vital moments in a document to expand on, to think about them, right? How do they rupture the dominant narrative? What is it doing to the dominant? right? So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's both of these. It's the intellectual and the political. Yes. Okay, I see. I know what you mean.
Expand on the spurious grounds in which.
I call this male disbelief. I mean, that is really a short answer, but there's a lot folded into this idea, which is things like, so on more concrete documentary terms, they would say things like, oh, this only has, stuff about soft society of women. Or people have made the argument, some fantastic translators have, modern translators have made the argument, her dates are wrong. And I want to ask them the question, this is a manuscript. It's a 16th century form. It's written in a stream of consciousness style, right? This is not dating. Dating is a modern journal practice. So how can you, and that stream of consciousness style actually really attracts me, right? You have to, I mean, it was exactly, I'll also give you a parallel example from my last book, Noor Jahan. People said to me repeatedly, oh, Jahangir does not write about her. So when I read the Jahangir Nama in Persian, there were 36 entries on Noor Jahan. And they were all about her killing, her hunting, including killing tigers, right? Terrifying tigers. And so I began to think about who killed tigers in early modern times, who was allowed to kill tigers. Why was he mentioning hunting repeatedly? It is one of the informal signs of sovereignty. So he's not going to say to us, 500 years later, Ruby, when I mention hunting, it means she is a co-sovereign, right? This is for the historian to put the clues together. So it's these sorts of things you're encountering. I mean, which goes against the grain of the very character of the chronicle itself, if that makes sense. Yes. Yes, lovely. Actually, she writes about the Babarname, and so two things in her own writing. One is as she's coming down in the caravan with her adopted mother. When they are near the Indus, the exchanges between Babar and the caravan have increased. And one of the things that happens is that he sends this man with a copy of a few pages of his Babarname to Kabul, to one of his cousins. And he stops on the way, and the women look at and she's of course very small at this time, so that's one of the encounters. But when they reach Agra, there was a particular place where Babar used to sit and write. And this was one of the moments Gulbadan used to love, which is to see her father sitting by the pond and writing his memoir.
That's how we know he was literate. And that he was right. Whereas, yes, that we don't know, we don't have any description of Akbar ever right. Akbar always had a scribe or self-styled illiterate, and he wanted to be himself.
Thank you for a tantalizing glimpse into a new or different ethos of writing history from which I think we will all benefit. So I'd like to thank you. There are books available. Rush. Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very
No, that was fun. Can I get you a glass of wine?
no, my-
I will, I'll pick it
Um,
up.
shall I-
And I apologize.
Shall I?
I'll